As Sarah stepped back, she could feel the weight of the room shift. The tension that had hung in the air like a thick fog was slowly dissipating. No one had noticed the subtle intervention she had made. The wealthy guests, now oblivious to the potential danger that had been looming, continued their conversations, laughing and toasting as if nothing had happened. But Sarah knew. She always knew. She had felt the change, the flicker of something wrong before anyone else had even sensed it. It was like a sixth sense, honed over years of surviving in a world where people looked past her, assumed she was nothing more than a quiet, unnoticed figure. And tonight, that quietness had saved them all. Alexander Davis, still seated at his table, had returned to his phone, his earlier arrogance almost palpable. But Sarah saw the subtle shift in his posture. He was aware of something now, something that had broken through the wall of indifference he usually carried. Maybe it was the way she had calmly warned him, or the fact that she had acted when no one else had. Either way, she could feel his eyes on her for the first time. She knew he was watching. She could feel the change. She moved quietly, gathering the dirty plates from the table next to his, making sure to avoid eye contact. There was no need to draw attention to herself. It was better this way. People were comfortable with what they didn't see, and she preferred it that way. For years, Sarah had kept herself hidden, not out of fear, but because it was easier. Easier to slip by unnoticed, to avoid the questions, the stares, the judgment. But tonight had been different. Tonight, she had acted. And tonight, she had been seen. As Sarah returned to the kitchen, her heart was still racing. She wasn't sure if it was the adrenaline or the realization that her life had just shifted in a way she couldn't fully comprehend. She had no idea how close they had come to disaster. No one had known, not even Alexander, but she had seen it. She had known. And now, she couldn't shake the feeling that the world was watching her in a way it never had before. Back in the kitchen, Sarah leaned against the cold stainless steel counter, trying to steady her breathing. She wiped her hands on her apron, trying to shake off the adrenaline that still buzzed under her skin. The familiar sounds of the kitchen, clattering pots, sizzling pans, and the occasional shout from the head chef, were a comfort. She had been in this environment for so long, it was like home. But tonight, it didn't feel quite the same. The door to the kitchen opened, and Sarah turned, half expecting to see one of the servers coming in with a new order. Instead, it was Alexander Davis. He stood there for a moment, his broad frame filling the doorway, before he stepped inside. His presence seemed to fill the room, even more so now that the danger had passed. Sarah felt a twinge of unease. She wasn't used to people like him, the ones who didn't need to ask for attention because it was already given to them. "You," he said, his voice steady, but with an edge she hadn't expected. "You saved us all." Sarah didn't respond right away. She didn't need to. She wasn't here for thanks or recognition. "I didn't save anyone," she said softly, avoiding his gaze. "I just did what needed to be done." But he wasn't listening. He took a step closer, his gaze fixed on her. "You knew. You knew something was wrong, and you acted. No one else did." Sarah glanced at him, feeling the weight of his words. It was strange to hear someone like him acknowledge her, even stranger that it felt real. She had spent so much of her life feeling invisible, like no one could see her, no one cared enough to notice. But Alexander Davis, the man who had spent years building an empire, was standing in front of her, acknowledging her in a way no one else ever had. For a moment, she almost forgot to breathe. "Why?" he asked, his tone shifting, softening. "Why didn't you just walk away? Why did you choose to warn me?" Sarah paused. She didn't have an answer ready. She never did. But in this moment, it didn't matter. The words came out before she could stop them. "Because I didn't want to see anyone hurt," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Alexander stood in front of her for a long moment, studying her, as if he was trying to understand her. She could see the flicker of realization in his eyes, the moment when he understood something more about her than just the woman who served drinks. He took a step back, his expression shifting. "I don't know who you really are," he said, his voice quiet now, "but I'm going to find out." Sarah felt a knot form in her stomach. She had no idea what he meant by that, but she couldn't help the small twinge of fear that crawled up her spine. But before she could respond, he turned and walked out of the kitchen, leaving her alone with the sound of her own thoughts. She didn't know what was coming next, but she could feel that nothing would ever be the same again. The days that followed felt surreal for Sarah. The normal rhythm of her shifts at the restaurant, The quiet exchanges with customers and the hum of activity in the kitchen all seemed to blur into something distant. It was as though she had stepped into a different version of her life, one where the quiet waitress who had always been invisible to the world was now seen by someone who mattered. Alexander Davis had left the kitchen that night with an air of uncertainty hanging around him. His words had left an impression on her, but Sarah wasn't the type to dwell on compliments. She preferred to stay unnoticed, to keep to her role as just another face in the crowd. But she couldn't deny the lingering tension in the air whenever he walked into the restaurant. He wasn't like the others. His presence was commanding, but there was something different now. He was watching her, and Sarah could feel it. He'd asked questions, and Sarah had given him nothing more than what he needed to hear. She didn't have time for games or idle curiosity. She was here to work, and that was it. But Alexander Davis didn't seem content with leaving things that way. Every time he came in for dinner, his eyes would find her across the room, and she would feel the weight of his gaze. He was always polite, always respectful, but there was an edge to him now, a quiet curiosity that had replaced the dismissive attitude he had shown in the past. One afternoon, just as Sarah was wiping down a table near the window, Alexander walked in. He was alone this time, no business partners or fancy guests in tow. He approached the host and whispered something Sarah couldn't quite hear. The host nodded and led him to a table near the back. Sarah was about to turn away when she saw him glance over his shoulder, his eyes locking with hers. For a moment, the world seemed to pause. He was no longer the untouchable billionaire. He was just a man sitting at a table, waiting for someone to serve him. It was an unusual feeling for Sarah, one she couldn't quite place. She had never been nervous before, not when dealing with anyone in this restaurant. But with him, it was different. She didn't know why, but she couldn't shake the sensation that everything had changed. Sarah walked over to his table, her steps calm but deliberate. She could feel his gaze following her every move as she approached. "Good evening, Mr. Davis," she said, her voice steady despite the strange flutter in her chest. He looked up, a small smile tugging at the corner of his lips. "Evening, Sarah," he replied, his tone warmer than usual. "You're here alone tonight?" "Yes, just a quick dinner," he said, looking at the menu for a moment before meeting her eyes again. "And you? How's your evening been?" Sarah blinked, caught off guard by the question. It wasn't the kind of thing she was used to hearing from someone like him. She hesitated before responding, trying to keep her voice neutral. "It's been fine. Busy as always." She paused, then added, "I'm surprised you're here by yourself." Alexander raised an eyebrow slightly, the faintest hint of a grin on his face. "I don't always need company, you know. Sometimes I like the quiet." His words were casual, but there was something else in them, something that made Sarah feel like he was speaking to her in a way he hadn't before. He wasn't the aloof billionaire anymore. He was just a man, sitting in front of her, talking about something as simple as enjoying a meal alone. Sarah nodded, unsure of how to respond. She had no interest in engaging in anything deeper than pleasantries, but his presence was making it harder to keep the conversation casual. "Well, if you need anything," she said, setting down a glass of water, "I'll be nearby." She turned to leave, but then he spoke again, his voice softer this time. "Sarah, wait." She stopped and turned back, her heart skipping a beat. He was watching her closely, his gaze unreadable. "Thank you," he said simply, "for what happened that night. I haven't forgotten." Sarah nodded, not trusting herself to speak. "It was nothing," she said quickly. "I did what I had to do." But Alexander wasn't convinced. "It wasn't nothing," he said, his tone firm now. "You saved everyone that night, and I owe you for that." Sarah didn't know how to respond to that. She wasn't the type to accept praise, especially not from someone like him. But the sincerity in his voice made her feel something unfamiliar, a tug in her chest that she quickly pushed aside. "Just doing my job, Mr. Davis," she said, her voice steady again. "I'll leave you to your dinner." She turned and walked away, her mind racing with questions she didn't have answers to. Why had he come to talk to her? Why had he acknowledged what she did? She had saved him, yes, but that didn't mean she needed anything in return. She wasn't looking for recognition. She was just doing what she felt was right. But as she walked back to the kitchen, she couldn't help but wonder if she had just crossed a line, stepping into a world she had never intended to be a part of. A world where people like Alexander Davis saw her as more than just a waitress. Days passed, and Sarah continued her routine at the restaurant. But something had shifted. She could feel it in the way Alexander Davis looked at her whenever he came in. It was subtle, almost imperceptible, but she knew he was watching her more closely now. She couldn't shake the feeling that something was waiting to happen, something she couldn't control. The quiet, unremarkable life she had built was slowly being replaced by something unfamiliar, and she wasn't sure if she was ready for it. Alexander didn't stop coming to the restaurant. He came alone, sometimes with a colleague, sometimes just for a quiet meal. Each time, his eyes would meet hers, and the tension in the air would grow, unnoticed by the others around them. He never said anything more than pleasantries, but it was the look in his eyes that left her uneasy. She had saved him once, and now, it seemed, he was trying to repay that favor, though she wasn't sure how or why. One evening, Sarah was walking through the dining area when she saw him sitting alone at his usual spot. His expression was different this time, softer, almost contemplative. It was the first time he had looked this vulnerable, and it made Sarah pause. She wasn't sure what drew her to his table that night, but she found herself standing there, asking the same simple question she always did. "Can I get you anything, Mr. Davis?" He looked up, his eyes lingering on hers for a moment longer than usual. "Actually, Sarah," he began, his voice quieter than she expected, "could you sit down for a moment?" The request was simple enough, but something in the way he said it made her hesitate. No one ever asked her to sit. She was just the waitress. But she found herself pulling out the chair and sitting across from him, her heart beating faster than usual. For a moment, neither of them said anything. The usual hum of the restaurant seemed to fade away, leaving just the two of them in a bubble of silence. Sarah didn't know what to say. She wasn't used to this. She wasn't used to him looking at her like this. After a long moment, Alexander spoke again. "I've been thinking a lot about what you did for me," he said, his tone more serious than she had ever heard it before. "And I feel like I owe you more than just gratitude. You saved my life, Sarah. You did something I couldn't have done, and it's not lost on me." Sarah swallowed, unsure of how to respond. "I didn't do anything," she said, trying to deflect his praise. "I just did what was right." He leaned forward slightly, his gaze intense. "No, what you did was more than just right. You were the only one who saw it, the only one who knew what was going on before it was too late. I don't forget things like that." His words were not the typical thanks she had received over the years. There was something deeper behind them, something that made her stomach twist with uncertainty. Sarah didn't want to get drawn into this. She wasn't looking for recognition, especially not from someone like him. "It's my job," she said quickly, trying to keep things casual. "I'm just here to serve, Mr. Davis." But Alexander didn't seem to buy it. "You're not just here to serve," he said, his voice soft but firm. "I've seen enough to know you're capable of far more than just bringing people their food. You've got a sharp mind, Sarah, and I want to offer you something." She stared at him, confused. "What do you mean?" He hesitated for a moment, as if weighing his words carefully. "I want you to consider joining my company. I've been looking for someone who can think on their feet, someone who isn't afraid to take action when it matters. You've already proven that to me." Sarah's heart skipped a beat. This wasn't happening. This couldn't be happening. He was offering her a job at his company. She wasn't qualified for that. She wasn't even remotely close to being in his world. "Mr. Davis, she began, but he cut her off. "I'm not offering you a job because of some misguided sense of charity," he said, his tone turning serious. "I'm offering it because you deserve it. You've got potential, Sarah. I see that." The words hung in the air between them, and for a moment, Sarah couldn't breathe. She wasn't sure what to say, what to do. This was everything she had never imagined, everything she had never even considered. She wasn't a businesswoman. She wasn't someone who could handle the pressure of a high-powered job. She was just a waitress. A waitress who had done her job well enough to save a room full of people, but nothing more. "I don't think I'm the right person for that," she said finally, her voice quiet. "I'm not who you think I am, Mr. Davis." He didn't respond right away, just studied her with those piercing eyes of his. Then, slowly, he nodded. "I understand," he said, his voice softening. "But the offer still stands. You don't have to decide now, Sarah. Just think about it." As he finished speaking, the weight of his words seemed to linger in the air between them. Sarah didn't know what to think or what to feel. The world she had always known was shifting in ways she couldn't control, and she wasn't sure how to handle it. As she stood up to leave, Alexander gave her one last look, his eyes searching hers as if trying to understand her better than anyone else had. She turned and walked away, but her mind was spinning. What had just happened? What was she supposed to do with this offer, with the sudden shift in her reality? She didn't have the answers, but something told her that her life was about to change, whether she was ready for it or not. The next few days were a blur for Sarah. She found herself walking through the motions at the restaurant, her mind heavy with the offer Alexander had made. He had been clear, too clear. He saw something in her, something she had never seen in herself. She wasn't sure if it was flattery or if he genuinely believed she could be more than a waitress, but the more she thought about it, the more her mind raced with possibilities. Could she really leave everything she knew behind? Could she really step into a world so far removed from the one she had spent years in? Alexander had asked her to think about it, and that was exactly what she had been doing. Every shift at the restaurant, every glance from him across the room, seemed to push her closer to a decision. Yet, the weight of that decision sat heavily on her shoulders, pulling her in two different directions. On the one hand, there was the life she had built, the quiet stability of working in the restaurant, where no one expected anything from her except to do her job. On the other, there was the allure of something more, something unknown but brimming with potential. One evening, after her shift had ended, Sarah sat in the small break room at the back of the restaurant, her fingers absent-mindedly twisting the fabric of her apron. She had stayed late that night, trying to clear her head. The last few hours had been especially busy, and she needed the time to think. As she sat there in the quiet, she heard the familiar sound of the restaurant's front door opening and closing. It was late, and only a few customers remained. But when she looked up, she saw Alexander standing in the doorway, looking as out of place as ever. He was dressed in a dark jacket, his usual sharp, well-tailored suit replaced by something more casual, yet still expensive. He was alone, no entourage of business partners or assistants. Just him. For a moment, they stood there, locked in a silent exchange. Neither of them spoke, but there was something unspoken in the air between them. It was as if the words from days earlier were still hanging in the balance, waiting for someone to take the first step. "Sarah," he said, his voice breaking the silence. "I know you've been thinking about my offer." She looked at him, her heart beating a little faster than usual. "I have," she replied softly. "And," he prompted. Sarah swallowed hard. "I don't know what to say, Mr. Davis," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I'm not sure I'm the right person for this." Alexander took a step closer, his gaze soft but intense. "I'm not asking you to be someone you're not," he said, his voice calm but firm. "I'm asking you to trust yourself. Trust me." Sarah's heart skipped a beat. "I don't know if I can do that," she admitted, her voice shaky. "I've never been someone who steps into the spotlight. I've always kept to the background." Alexander's expression softened, and he moved closer, his tone reassuring. "And that's exactly why I believe you'd be perfect for this," he said. "You see the things others don't. You're not caught up in the game like everyone else. That's what makes you valuable." Sarah looked down at her hands, twisting the fabric of her apron again. She had always been the quiet one, the one who observed everything but never spoke up. She didn't know how to handle this level of attention, this pressure. "I don't know if I'm cut out for it," she said, her voice low. Alexander crouched down to her level, his gaze steady. "You're more than capable, Sarah. You just need to believe that." She stared at him, unsure of what to say. He was offering her a chance that seemed too good to be true. But Sarah wasn't sure if she was ready to take that leap. She wasn't sure if she was ready to leave behind everything she had ever known for something so uncertain. "I can't promise you anything," she said, finally meeting his eyes. "But I'll think about it. I'll figure out what's best for me." Alexander studied her for a long moment, his gaze searching her face. Then, slowly, he nodded. "Take your time," he said, his voice softening. "But know that the door is always open for you, Sarah, whenever you're ready." With that, he stood up and walked toward the door. Sarah watched him leave, her heart still racing. She wasn't sure if she was ready for what he was offering, but the more she thought about it, the more she realized she couldn't keep running from the opportunity. She would have to make a choice soon, but for now, all she could do was wait. Wait for the right moment to take that step into the unknown. The following week, Sarah felt the pressure building. The decision weighed on her like an anchor, keeping her grounded in a world she had always known. But with every passing day, the weight of Alexander's offer pulled at her, tugging her closer to a choice she wasn't sure she was ready to make. She had never been the type to make bold moves, to step out of her comfort zone. But now, everything was changing. Each time she walked into the restaurant, her eyes would automatically search for Alexander. And every time, she found him sitting there, calm and collected, as if he knew exactly what was going through her mind. He had given her the space to decide, but his quiet presence seemed to speak louder than words ever could. One evening, as Sarah was taking a break in the back of the restaurant, she overheard a conversation between two of the regulars. They were discussing the latest buzz about Alexander's company and his upcoming projects. The conversation was filled with excitement and admiration for the man she had come to know, even if only in passing. They spoke of him as though he was untouchable, as though his every move was calculated and perfect. And yet, Sarah knew something they didn't. She knew the side of him that had been hidden from the public, the side that had trusted her, the side that had seen something in her no one else had. As the days went by, Sarah's thoughts became more consumed with the idea of the offer. What if she could make a difference in that world? What if she could be more than just a waitress? But the fear of the unknown kept her rooted in doubt. She wasn't sure if she was ready to walk away from everything she had worked for, everything that had kept her grounded. But as she prepared for another shift, she felt a shift within herself. She was no longer the same person she had been when she first walked into this restaurant. She had grown, silently, and without even realizing it. She was no longer the quiet, overlooked waitress who blended into the background. She had taken control of her own story. That night, as she set the table for Alexander, she felt a quiet resolve settle within her. She couldn't keep avoiding the inevitable. She had to decide. When she finally walked over to his table, she felt a sense of calm wash over her. The words that had been trapped in her mind for days now came easily. "Mr. Davis," she said, her voice steady, "I've made my decision." He looked up at her, his expression unreadable. For a moment, the world seemed to stop. "I've thought about your offer," she continued, "and I'm ready to take the next step. I want to work with you." A flicker of surprise passed across his face, but it quickly disappeared, replaced by a look of approval. "I'm glad to hear that," he said, his voice warm. "I knew you'd make the right choice." Sarah felt a strange mix of fear and excitement surge through her. The unknown was still there, still looming ahead of her, but now, it felt like an opportunity rather than a threat. She had taken the first step into a new chapter of her life, and while she wasn't sure what would come next, she knew one thing for sure. She was no longer going to let fear control her. As she walked away from his table that night, her heart felt lighter. She had made a choice, a big one. And while the future was uncertain, for the first time in a long time, she was excited to face it head on. The following week, Sarah walked into the restaurant with a new sense of purpose. The familiar clink of glasses, the soft murmur of conversations, and the constant rhythm of the kitchen seemed different now. She was no longer just another waitress. She had made a decision, and with it came the weight of responsibility, but also a sense of excitement. She had agreed to work with Alexander, and though she wasn't entirely sure what to expect, she felt like she was stepping into a new world. That evening, after her shift, Alexander asked her to meet him at his office. He had said that it was time to begin, but Sarah wasn't sure what that meant. She had imagined herself in a new role, but she never imagined the first step would come so quickly. As she stood outside the towering office building, Sarah took a deep breath. This was it. She walked through the lobby, her heels clicking on the marble floors, her heart racing in anticipation. She had never been in a place like this before. The sleek, modern design, the polished surfaces, the feeling of wealth and power that permeated the air, it was all so new. As she stepped into the elevator and pressed the button for the top floor, she couldn't help but feel a bit out of place. She was just a waitress. What did someone like her have to offer in a world like this? But the doors closed with a soft chime, and she forced herself to focus on the moment. When the elevator stopped, she stepped out and was greeted by a sleek receptionist who led her to a large conference room. Alexander was waiting for her, sitting at the head of the table, his usual confident demeanor in place. But this time, there was something different about him. He wasn't as distant or detached as he had been before. There was an ease to him, a warmth that hadn't been there before. "Sarah," he said with a smile, standing up to greet her. "I'm glad you made it. Please, have a seat." As she sat down across from him, She noticed a stack of papers on the table. He pushed them toward her, his expression serious. "I know this is all happening fast," he began, "but I want you to be a part of something bigger. This company needs someone who isn't afraid to make tough decisions, to see things from a different perspective. I believe you have that ability." Sarah looked down at the papers, her heart pounding. She had no idea what she was looking at, but the weight of the decision in front of her was becoming all too real. "I don't have a background in business," she said quietly. "I don't even know where to begin." Alexander's eyes softened, and he leaned forward slightly. "That's exactly why I want you," he said. "You're not burdened by the conventional thinking that holds so many people back. You see things differently, and that's the perspective I need. The world isn't about playing by the rules. It's about knowing when to break them." Sarah swallowed, her mind racing. She had no idea what he saw in her, but she knew one thing for sure. She couldn't go back to the life she had known. The waitress who simply took orders and followed instructions was gone. She had to step up. She had to prove to herself and to Alexander that she was capable. "I'm ready," she said, her voice steady but filled with a new sense of determination. "I'll do whatever it takes." Alexander smiled, his eyes gleaming with something like approval. "I knew you would," he said. "Now let's get to work." The next few weeks were a whirlwind. Sarah threw herself into learning everything she could. Alexander guided her through meetings, introduced her to key players in the company, and slowly, but surely, she started to see the business world through a different lens. She wasn't just the quiet waitress anymore. She was becoming someone who could make decisions, someone whose opinion mattered. But with the new role came new challenges. Sarah had to navigate office politics, deal with pressure from all sides, and find her place in a world where she still felt like an outsider. There were moments of self-doubt, when she questioned whether she had made the right choice. But every time she felt like giving up, Alexander was there, reminding her that she belonged. "You're not here by mistake," he told her once, after a particularly difficult meeting. "You've earned your place. Now don't be afraid to take it." As time passed, Sarah began to trust herself more. She saw the changes in the company, in the way people started to look at her, not as the quiet waitress who took orders, but as someone who had a voice, someone who had the power to shape decisions. Alexander's confidence in her had become contagious. She started to believe in herself, to see the potential that had always been there, hidden beneath the surface. One evening, as she left the office, she found herself walking down the same path she had walked so many times before, through the lobby, across the marble floors, into the elevator. But this time, it felt different. This time, she wasn't just passing through. She was a part of something bigger. She was no longer the woman who blended into the background. She had made her mark, and she was just getting started. As the weeks passed, Sarah began to feel more and more at home in her new role. She was no longer the timid waitress who had once served meals in silence. Now, she was a confident, capable part of the team, respected by her colleagues, and even starting to earn the trust of the higher-ups in Alexander's company. She spent her days diving into projects, analyzing data, and making decisions that she never would have dreamed of making just a few months ago. But there was still a sense of discomfort that lingered deep within her. It wasn't the work itself. It was the constant pressure, the feeling of never quite being able to shake off the sense that she didn't fully belong. She had come so far, but she was still constantly aware of how different her background was from the world she was now a part of. Every meeting with the executives, every decision that carried the weight of thousands of dollars, made her feel like an outsider, like someone who had stumbled into a world she wasn't meant to be in. And yet, every time she looked across the table and saw Alexander's approving gaze, that feeling of doubt began to fade, replaced by something stronger, determination. It was clear that he believed in her, perhaps more than she believed in herself. There were moments when the old Sarah, the one who had been content with her quiet, unnoticed life, crept into her thoughts. She would remember the days when her biggest concern had been getting through the shift, making just enough to pay the bills, and keeping her head down. But those days were gone. She wasn't that person anymore. And in those moments of reflection, she realized that she had become someone entirely different. But with this change came an entirely new set of challenges. Alexander had given her more responsibility, more trust, and more pressure. There were days when it felt like too much, when the weight of it all felt like it might crush her. But when those moments came, she reminded herself why she was here. She had worked hard to get to this point, and she wasn't going to let the fear of the unknown hold her back. One afternoon, she found herself in a meeting with Alexander and the rest of the senior team. The discussion was intense, with a lot of back and forth about the company's next big move. Sarah was listening closely, analyzing every piece of information, trying to piece it all together. When the conversation shifted to a new project that would require significant investment, Alexander turned to Sarah. "What do you think, Sarah?" he asked, his voice steady but with a clear note of expectation. Sarah's heart skipped a beat. The room went silent, all eyes on her. She wasn't used to this, wasn't used to being the one asked to make a decision that could affect the entire company. But she had come this far. She couldn't back down now. She took a deep breath, collecting her thoughts before speaking. "I think we need to approach this cautiously," she said, her voice steady despite the rush of nerves that threatened to overwhelm her. "The investment is substantial, and while the potential return is high, we should consider diversifying the risks by testing the waters with a smaller scale launch before committing fully." She paused, allowing her words to sink in. The room was still. Then, slowly, Alexander nodded, a small smile playing at the corner of his mouth. "I agree," he said. "That's a smart move, Sarah. Well done." The relief that washed over her was immediate, and for the first time in a long time, she allowed herself to relax. She had done it. She had made a decision that mattered, and not only had it been accepted, but it had been praised. It was moments like this that made everything worth it, the sleepless nights, the self-doubt, the feeling of being out of place. She was proving to herself, and to everyone else, that she was capable of more than she had ever imagined. As the meeting concluded and everyone filed out, Alexander stayed behind for a moment, giving Sarah a quiet nod as he passed her. "You're doing great," he said quietly, his voice low enough that only she could hear. "Keep it up." She watched him leave, her heart racing. She wasn't sure what the future held, but for the first time, she felt like she was ready to face it head on. She wasn't the same person she had been when she first walked into that restaurant, and she knew that whatever happened next, she was capable of handling it. The old Sarah, the one who had kept her head down and avoided the spotlight, was gone. The new Sarah was just getting started. Months passed, and Sarah found herself more entrenched in the world she had once only observed from the outside. She was no longer just the quiet woman in the background, the one who served others without ever being seen. Now, she was a key player in the business decisions of the company, her insights valued and her contributions making a difference. There were still moments when she doubted herself, when the weight of her new role felt overwhelming. But every time those doubts crept in, she remembered the person she had been before all of this, the woman who had walked into that restaurant with nothing but her dreams, unsure of what the future held. Now, she was forging her own path, making choices that impacted more than just her. She had become someone she never thought she could be. It was a late evening when Alexander called her into his office once again. She had gotten used to the late meetings by now, but this time, there was a different energy in the air. Alexander was waiting for her, his expression unreadable. He didn't waste time with pleasantries. "Sarah, I've been thinking," he said, his voice calm but serious. "You've done more for this company than I ever expected. You've proven yourself." Her heart skipped a beat. She had never expected praise from him. He had always been supportive, yes, but he rarely gave out compliments. "Thank you, Mr. Davis," she said, unsure of where this conversation was heading. "I appreciate everything you've taught me." Alexander shook his head, his expression softening. "It's not just about what I've taught you. It's about what you've taught yourself. You've made decisions, you've taken risks, and you've built something here. You've done more than most people who've been in this business for years." Sarah felt a lump form in her throat. She had come so far, but there were still so many things she didn't know, so many challenges ahead. "I still don't feel like I'm there yet," she admitted. "I'm still learning, every day." Alexander leaned forward, locking eyes with her. "You're further than you think," he said, his voice steady. "And that's why I'm asking you something important. I want you to consider taking on a larger role, a bigger position within the company." Sarah blinked, caught off guard. "A bigger role?" she repeated, her voice barely above a whisper. "Yes," he said, nodding. "I believe you have the vision and the drive to take this company to the next level. I want you to be a part of that future." Her mind raced, unsure of how to respond. This was the opportunity she had always dreamed of, but now that it was in front of her, She wasn't sure she was ready. I don't know, she said honestly, her voice trembling slightly. It's a huge responsibility. Alexander's gaze softened. It is, but I've seen what you're capable of, and I trust you. Sarah stood there for a moment, her heart pounding in her chest. She had worked so hard to get here, but this was different. This wasn't just a step up, it was a leap into the unknown. But something deep inside her told her that it was the right move. She had already come so far, and now was the time to fully embrace what she had built. Okay, she said, her voice firm now. I'll do it. Alexander smiled, a look of pride in his eyes. I knew you would, he said, standing up. Welcome to the next chapter, Sarah. As she walked out of his office, her mind was racing. She had made her decision, and now there was no turning back. The next chapter was waiting for her, and she was ready to face it head on. The path ahead was uncertain, but for the first time, she felt confident in her ability to navigate it. She was no longer the woman who had walked into the restaurant unsure of what the future held. She was the woman who had built a future for herself, and now, it was time to build something even bigger. She smiled to herself, knowing that this was just the beginning.